about a billion years. Now we have a group of organisms that we talked about called cyanobacteria that are beginning to produce oxygen. So for about 1.5 billion years, we have bacteria, nothing but bacteria. They start making oxygen. Oxygen levels now begin to rise. That means we begin to form an ozone layer. That means we basically get a force field against the sun's radiation. Now, if you live in shallow water or on land, your chances of being destroyed by ultraviolet light radiation are much, much less. You have a much better chance of actually surviving and getting fewer gene mutations. So the bacteria mainly responsible for that explosion of oxygen can be cyanobacteria, otherwise known as blue-green algae. These are single-celled organisms that do photosynthesis, like plants do. They start cranking out tons and tons and tons and tons of oxygen for billions of years. They're found in oceans, freshwater, and exposed rocks. We have some fossil evidence to show you of these guys. They're capable of photosynthesis. They are the oldest photosynthetic organisms that we know of so far because they're very primitive. Some of them do what's called nitrogen fixation, where they're actually taking nitrogen in the air and they stick it into organic compounds. That way plants can take advantage of them. That's why you guys add nitrogen to your fertilizer for your plants to grow. They need nitrogen. And it's probably these bacteria that help it to actually go from a gaseous form in the air to actually being found present in the soil and the dirt for future land plants to take advantage of.
So their byproduct is oxygen, that's how they produce
Uh-huh.
a ton of oxygen?
And this is some of the fossil record of them. Here we have a photograph, I think somewhere near Australia. These are called stromatolites. And they look like layer cakes when you slice them in half. These are just previous generations of these bacteria, but they take thousands of years to create. So these guys are probably tens of thousands of years old. But they were sort of our little oxygen factories. Now imagine the ocean floor is being covered in these things. Just slowly creating oxygen over billions of years, we get to have a lot of oxygen surrounding our planet. Now we have to have lots of oxygen because we need to have what's called this sort of eukaryotic explosion. So we're looking at right now sort of this idea right here of how plants are going to evolve. We have to have plants because in order to have land animals, we have to have lots of oxygen in the atmosphere. So we have to understand how these guys form first before we can talk about actually animals on land. But we do have animals currently right now in this little time movie in your mind in the oceans. All right, we're talking about getting oxygen in the atmosphere. But there are already animals living in the oceans. They're pretty much soft-bodied animals. But the oceans have dissolved oxygen in them. By the time the plants have been around for hundreds of millions of years, slowly cranking out lots of oxygen, slowly building that ozone layer to protect you from the sun's radiation, we're getting what's called the Cambrian explosion. This is a time period where all of a sudden, if you look a little bit below, so first like digging a sample of Earth right here, let's just put modern Earth right up here. And then we know that things get layered. And so the further down you go, right, the older the Earth is, the older life is. And let's say you're looking right in here, and look at all the different fossils you find right now buried in the ground. Let's just say there's 100 fossils in this layer. When you get to the next layer a little bit above it, you get a huge explosion of maybe 1,000 different types of fossils found. That's an explosion of fossils. That's what's called the Cambrian explosion. This happens during the Cambrian period, which is several hundred million years ago. Well, how could you go from having just a few fossils in one layer of dirt to all of a sudden now we have thousands of different kinds of fossils? What would allow that to happen? Well, a lot of these are land animals. We have to have oxygen in the atmosphere before you can get land animals running around on the ground. Well, that would be probably because of these guys cranking out lots of oxygen over millions of years, getting oxygen in the atmosphere so they can thrive and survive. And this is what probably was living in the oceans. Just a cartoon of looking at, you're going to have Nigerians, in other words, jellyfish and squids and little stone animals and shellfish running around. And then they're going to be able to then transfer onto land, which we'll talk a little bit about in a couple of weeks from now. Well, your textbook probably has some numbers that need to be changed. If the Cambrian explosion, which was this time period right here, where we had lots of animals showing up on land, and this is dated roughly around 600 million years ago, then how come plants, according to maybe your current book, I haven't actually remembered what the date is, but I was taught in my first college degree that land plants showed up around 350 to 400 million years ago. And then we got some better evidence. I think your book's probably somewhere like around 475 million years ago. Well then, how come animals got there first? If this is 600 million years ago, and your book says land plants showed up around 475 million years ago, that doesn't make sense. How can animals be here before land plants? You have to have land plants first. Otherwise, what are the animals going to eat, first of all, besides each other? Right? And where does the oxygen come from? Well, the point I'm trying to make is, up until 3 years ago, a good modern textbook would have land plants showing up around 500 million years ago. There was an article in Science Magazine published about 2 years ago that now pushes the date back to at least around 700 million years ago, with DNA evidence. So looking at DNA of fossilized plants and DNA of fossilized fungi, mushrooms. Well, that kind of makes sense if you think about it just logically. If we are trying to understand that the Cambrian explosion was about a mass of animals being on the land, then how can they be there before plants? But this number kind of matches with the new fossil evidence of plants, saying that plants have been here actually a lot longer than we first thought. They've been around here for at least 700 million years. That kind of coincides and ties with the idea of fossil evidence. Now that number might even get pushed. So I want us to look at the idea of land plants being here as much as 700 million years ago. This is why you got to buy new textbooks in a sense. Now, what were plants like 700 million years ago? They were pretty much like seaweed in a sense. But we do know that our earliest form of land plant that we can find so far, fossil evidence, is a plant known as chara. It is a member of the green algae family. Remember, green algae were those cyanobacteria guys, cranking out lots of oxygen. They dated it back to about 500 million years, but we now know we can change that to 700 million years. Which means then the climate is changing. We're getting lots of oxygen. We're getting lots of ozone. Another fact we don't have in your lecture notes that coincides with this is, anybody ever heard of what's called snowball Earth? So it's a time period where geologists think that the Earth was entirely covered by snow. Entirely covered by a gigantic glacier period. The only way for that to happen is if the Earth's atmosphere cools. But it won't cool unless there's an ozone layer, because there's lots of methane in the atmosphere right now, lots of carbon dioxide. In other words, greenhouse gases. So it makes sense that snowball Earth timing coincides with the arrival of land plants to create a more oxygenated atmosphere, which allowed for the Earth's atmosphere to drop tremendously for an actual snowball effect. Well, let's look at what sea life was like in terms of plants living in the ocean. We know that algae, which really is seaweed in your all's mind, because seaweed is algae, but not all of algae is seaweed. They have some very common things between seaweed living in the ocean you guys eat and land plants we have today. They both have to have chloroplasts, right, to do photosynthesis. They both have to have the enzyme called chlorophyll A and B to actually do the photosynthesizing. They have to have a cell plate, which is a part of a cell wall. So algae have these, and so do land plants. Now we know plants are going to be multicellular. Remember, bacteria are single-celled organisms. So now we have a multicellular eukaryotic organism. It has cell walls. It's photosynthetic. It's an autotroph. What kind of an autotroph is it? Does anybody know? So, yeah, you know. You just haven't.
Photoautotrope.
It's a photoautotrof. Why did you say photoautotrof?
Because
Because
it's photosynthetic.
it's photosynthetic, right? It takes sunlight and uses that as its form of energy and turns non-organic compounds into organic compounds. That's what trophs do. But the problem is, how do you go from living in the ocean to now living on land? It's a lot different. You need a lot more structures to be able to do this. So this is a photograph of what Chara is like. We still have it today. You can still walk around and find this plant. This is a rather primitive plant. If you were to become a plant designer, this is version 1. And right now we're on version 15. So this is like a really early version of computer programming. If you walk around today, you can find this walking around today. Anybody ever seen that?
Yeah.
Right? You know what it's called?
What?
It's called horsetail. Otherwise known as esquisitum, but this is a weed. This is what's called the the vegetative stage, and this is the reproductive stage. Looks like asparagus in a sense. Do not eat it, for God's sake. It's got glass crystals, it's got silicone and silicate inside of it. But it is still a plant living today. Now the only difference is, today you might find it being about this tall. And it likes to live around ponds and in the forest where it's really moist. Around 200 million years ago, it probably had a diameter of about 15 feet. It might have been as tall as 100 feet. It was a lot bigger back then. But again, it's doing photosynthesis, right? So we're creating lots of oxygen. We've got Chara, still living today, that was in existence 200 million years ago. So these two are really nice examples of what plants were like way back then. You can actually find them today, you can dissect them, study them, and look at how organisms might have survived way back then. So how do we get Chara? How do we get horsetail? Well, we need to understand what has to happen for plants to go from seaweed, living in water, to now living on land where you're not in the water. First thing to notice is that seaweed does not have any roots. It doesn't need roots. What are roots for? Getting water. And why would I need roots if I'm surrounded by water? Right? It doesn't make sense to have roots. The water also helps to keep you standing upright. You don't need a stem or a stalk. So you've got water that gives you nutrients. You've got water to keep you supported upright. Are you going to get dried out by the sun? No, that's not even a problem. But they do have to do photosynthesis. So these guys need to live in rather shallow water. You're not going to find them in 300, 400 feet deep water, or even deeper than that, because the sunlight won't reach that far down. Now, they do have what's called a hold fast. It's a root-looking like thing, if you ever rip seaweed off of the ocean floor, but it's not roots. They don't need a stem, but they do have to do photosynthesis, where they can take in sunlight and CO2 and start cranking out some oxygen, but the water will help support them. Now, how do you get from being in water to now being on land? One of the big differences is you're no longer surrounded by water. That gives you 3 problems. A, how do you stand upright? And first of all, why would you want to stand upright? So I can be in the sunshine. I need a stem to do that. I'm now living in a rather maybe kind of an arid-like environment compared to my ancestors, my great-grandparents. So I need to have roots to do 2 things. Bring up nutrients, but also anchor me to the ground, so I don't blow around like a tumbleweed. So I need roots to hang on, I need roots to get the water up, I need a stem so I can stand upright. But now you have a really big, nasty problem. You're going to become dehydrated. You're going to turn into beef jerky. You're going to become a dead, dried out leaf. So how do you keep the moisture locked inside of you? You need what's called a cuticle. It's a thin little waxy layer that's on top of leaves. And it's designed to keep the moisture in, so you don't dry out. You need leaves that do photosynthesis. Well, algae is one big gigantic leaf in a sense, so they can do it quite easily. But we also have to have leaves so we can do photosynthesis. So you need a cuticle to keep water loss, you don't become dried out. You need a stem to keep you standing upright. You need roots to keep you anchored, but also to get water from the ground itself. And when you look at horsetail and you look at chara, they have very similar like designs. They both have silica, which is glass-like material, in their leaf structures. They have a very thin cuticle. They have a rather primitive set of roots. They have stems, so they're a nice little model for what plants were like hundreds of millions of years ago. Here's a fossil record of what's known as Cooksonia, and even that number has to be changed in the future. Someone studies it, but this is a fossil imprint, so we know they were around a long time ago. We can see their stems. All right, so if we're getting plants to go from the oceans onto land, think of evolution as a computer programmer. You got version 1. It's got a lot of problems, but it gets the job done. Then you have version 1.1, right? 1.2, 1.3. Finally get to version 2, then 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, version 3, 3.1, 3.2, right? 4, 5, and 6. Right now we're looking at an atmosphere that has a lot of sunlight, a lot of oxygen beginning to show up, and we're a rather wet, moist environment. And when you look at plants, we have two major ways of thinking about it. I know plants live in really damp, wet areas. I also know plants live in rather dry areas. Well, if you think about who lives where, we can take all types of plants, remember we're really anal as biologists, and create two major categories. Non-vascular plants, plants that don't have any blood vessel-like structures. The structures are actually called xylem and phloem. These are basically the pipes that are found in plants that move water up and down. And this means if you have xylem and phloem, it means you're vascularized. Right? We're vascularized. We have pipes to move fluid and nutrients throughout our bodies. Plants need the same thing. So we have one group that are called non-vascular plants, and then we have another group called the vascular plants, meaning they do have that idea of xylem and phloem. You guys in the cheap seats over here.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay? Now, what's an example of a non-vascular plant? Well, something called bryophytes, whatever the heck those things are. Moss. Mosses belong in the category called bryophytes. Mosses that you guys see on the sidewalk, right, growing out of concrete, are non-vascularized plants. Who are examples of our plants? And these are kind of in order of computer programming. Advanced. We're going to look at early club mosses. From them we're going to evolve into ferns and horsetails. From these guys we're going to evolve into a group called gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are basically trees. And then from gymnosperms we're going to evolve and have what's called angiosperms. Flowering plants. If you have a flower on you, then you're going to be an angiosperm.
So you're gonna do a tree.
Yep. So apple trees, right? They're actually an angiosperm. So we're going from really primitive to a little more advanced still, even more advanced yet, and even more advanced still. And keep in mind, evolution has not stopped. This idea of advancement has not stopped. So who knows what's going to happen a couple of million years from now. We might have yet another category of plants to understand and study. So here's sort of a pictorial diagram of the evolution. And when you arrange plants based upon how they are related to each other, it's called the phylogeny. Their family tree in a sense. Right? Remember, we need to change this number, right, to at least now 700 million years ago. But we can see how we have very primitive plants becoming more and more and more advanced as we go further and further along. We're going to study each and every one of these to see what they're actually made up of.
You said that's the family tree of the plant?
Yep, family trees of plants.
Does it tell you like how old they are? Or just
To a
like
degree,
there's-
yeah. It's more about how related they are, but then you can also arrange them by age as well. All right, let's look at the bryophytes. Right, these are mosses. First thing to realize is that they had to protect eggs and sperm from drying out. This is why moss lives in really moist, wet environments. They don't have a true vascular system. Remember, they're a category of the non-vascular plants. We're going to look at their life cycle, and it's going to alternate from one generation to the next. So it's called alternation of generations. We're going to look at meiosis is used to produce spores. This is where you have to stop and practice this. Right now, meiosis in you guys produces eggs and sperm. Eggs and sperm are gametes. But in mosses, meiosis does not produce eggs and sperm. It actually produces spores. Mitosis is what produces eggs and sperm in mosses. You got to just practice this. So meiosis does spores, mitosis does gametes. Let's look at their pattern of alternating generations. We have diploid, which means what? What does diploid mean?
A cell that has a
Guys,
pair.
you just had this on Thursday. I haven't gotten, actually, I'm on that page right now on your exam.
It's the end of
Then you didn't even
mitosis.
tell me what a haploid means.
It's double.
Yeah, it's double.
It's double? What do you mean double?
It's the, there's two.
It has the
there's
same
two
set of,
versions.
it has the same, yeah, in each one. Has two.
All right, so here's the difference. You can't say it has 46 chromosomes.
No, it's one of each.
All right. You've got 23 pairs of chromosomes. You have a pair of each kind. Right? It isn't the number 23. You can't, well, it depends on how you say it, right?
Okay.
But diploid means two, meaning you've got one from mom, one from dad. You have two versions of the same chromosome. That's what it really means. Whether you've got 10 chromosomes or you've got 100. But it really means that you've got two of each kind. So these guys are diploid. But then we have haploid, which means you only have half the number of chromosomes. You only have one of each kind. Well, we know spores are haploid. So let's start with these guys. Spores are haploid, like eggs and sperm. Now, spores are going to be released into the air. They're going to land on the ground. And when the spores land on the ground, they're going to begin to grow into little teeny plant-like structures. We call the individual plant-like structures a gametophyte because they produce gametes. They're going to produce eggs and sperm. So you've got a spore that's haploid, lands on the ground, grows into either a male or a female plant called a gametophyte. Males produce sperm, but they're haploid. Females produce eggs, but they're haploid. What happens when you mix haploid with haploid? You get diploid, right? You get a pair of each set of chromosomes. Well, when you get fertilization and you get a little baby plant to grow, it has to grow through mitosis because one cell has to become two, two has to become four, has to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, what the baby grows into is what's called the sporophyte. Now look at the name gametophyte. What do gametophytes produce? They produce eggs and sperm. They produce gametes. Well, look at a sporophyte. What do they produce? They produce spores. But they produce them through meiosis. The plants created their gametes through mitosis, which is totally backwards from us. Right? And then they're going to grow through mitosis. So we're alternating between mitosis and meiosis, but also between haploid and diploid, and between sporophyte and gametophyte. There's all this alternating going on. Well, let's see what they look like. Here's another picture to show you. So you might have seen moss that looks like this. Let me go to the next picture to show you guys this little image here. Let's look at this guy right here. I want you, is the next chance you get up and close and personal with some moss. Right? You can't stick your face in it, take a picture of it, and then zoom in on it. So you can see this. Well, I can see the green part. That's what you guys see on concrete and right on growing buildings. But then it has this little stalk-like thing sticking straight up. The green part is this part right here. It's this part. Well, what was that part? Well, that was actually the gametophyte. We'll get to it in a second. So in here is called the sporophyte, just the brown part. It produces spores. They're going to pop open, and we know the spores are made through meiosis. Here they're bursting, releasing their spore-like structures in the air. It lands on the ground. We know these are haploid. They grow into male and female parts. When you get to the top part, just up in here, and you zoom in on them, you're going to find a structure that looks like this, or one that looks like this. Well, since this structure is producing male gametes, it's called the gametophyte. And this structure produces female gametes. It's a gametophyte as well. The sperm have to get to the ova. Now, they don't fly in the air, so you need water to actually swim through. They have to live in a moist environment, even to get the sperm to go from the male structure to the female structure. It has to be moisture for them to do so. Now, here's the sperm are going to come down in here. There's one right there. It's going to fertilize the egg. So haploid and haploid gives you diploid. You start to produce now a little baby structure. Think of this as a vase. And now you have a plant in the bottom of the vase. The plant's going to grow up out of the vase. Here's the plant growing, and it produces this structure right here. Because this green part right there is this piece right here. This stalk is growing up out of it. But what does that stalk-like thing produce? Well, it produces spores. So we call it a sporophyte. And it's haploid or diploid.
Diploid.
The actual structure is diploid, but as you go through meiosis, you end up making haploid structures, because from one you get four, each with their share of chromosomes. Well, let's look at it in this sense. So from now on, when you guys see the green part of moss, you're looking at the gametophyte. When you see the brown top-like structure, that's actually the sporophyte. The gametophyte is the main dominant part that you see. It's the overall more dominant of the two structures. It's always present when you look at it. Here's a zoomed up look of the sporophyte. And inside are lots and lots of spores. And if we look at kind of the cartoon section of it, we can see the tissue and the sporangium, the spore-producing tissue, and then the top part of my capsule. But this whole thing is of the sporophyte. And it's growing still inside the parent plant. It's still inside the gametophyte structure. So here's some more moss called sphagnum, otherwise known as peat moss. The green part is the gametophyte. The little top part is the sporophyte. This is club moss. You got the gametophyte and the sporophyte up in there. Oops, wrong direction. So overall, we can then look at sort of the order of plants. So we're going to have gametophytes, which are mosses. right? They require a moist, wet environment to grow in. They go through an alternation of generations, from diploid to haploid, back to diploid, back to haploid. We go from gametophytes that produce egg and sperm to sporophytes that produce spores. Spores are made through meiosis, and gametophytes are made through mitosis. You just have to memorize that. It's going to change. We're going to then evolve into a little more complicated thing we can call then a fern. And then from ferns, we're going to evolve into gymnosperms, and from gymnosperms, we're going to evolve into angiosperms. So what you got to practice is this whole idea of this alternating of generations. I want you guys to now, when you walk out and look at moss, when you touch the green fuzzy stuff, you're touching then a gametophyte or a sporophyte.
Gametophyte.
The green fuzzy stuff.
Gametophyte.
Right. If you have a little stalk-like umbrella-like thing, like in foofy drinks, right? That's a sporophyte, because that produces spores. We're going to see how this changes, but it's also how rather similar than in moss and in other forms of ferns.
You said something else came after sporophyte.
Now look at the picture. So here's a sporophyte right here, right? What does a sporophyte produce? What's that top thing called?
I thought gametophytes produced sporophytes.
And sporophytes produce gametophytes. It's a circular pattern.
It's a circular pattern.
So like, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Actually, there's an answer to that.
I was gonna say.
We'll get to that later. Okay. So let's see if we can look at an example of these guys.
How long does it take for a full cycle to be completed?
And it depends on the species of moss. Usually a couple of weeks. Let's try this. My link is broken. They're doing ferns. All right, let's see what Hank.
Found for a lot longer than animals. The plants that we see today probably evolved from a single species of algae that nudged itself on shore about 1.2 billion years ago. And from that one little piece of algae, all of the 500,000 or so species of plants that we have today evolved. But of course, all this didn't happen overnight. It wasn't until about 475 million years ago that the first plants started to evolve. And they were very simple, didn't have a lot of...
Always either male or female. The male makes sperm through mitosis in a feature called the antheridia, the male reproductive structure, while the female gametophyte makes the egg also through mitosis inside the female reproductive structures, which are called the archegonia. Now these two gametophytes might be hanging out right next to each other, sperm and eggs totally ready to go, but they can't do anything until water is introduced to the situation. So let's just add a sprinkle of water and take a tour of the bryophyte sex cycle, shall we? By way of the water, the sperm finds its way to the female and then into the egg, where the two gametes fuse to create a diploid zygote, which divides by mitosis and grows into a sporophyte. The sporophyte grows inside the mother until one day it cracks open and the sporophyte sends up a long stalk with a little cap on top called the calyptra. This protective case is made out of the remaining piece of the mother gametophyte, and under it a capsule forms full of thousands of little diploid spores. When the capsule is mature, the lid falls off and the spores are exposed to the air. If humidity levels are high enough, the capsule will let the spores go to meet their fate. Now, if one lands on a basketball court or something, it will just die if it doesn't get water. But if it lands on moist ground, it germinates, producing a little filament called the proteinema. gives rise to buds. These eventually grow into a patch of moss, which is just a colony of haploid gametophytes. That generation will mate and make sporophytes, and the generations will continue their alternation
I get it.
Now, because non-vascular plants are the least complex kind of plants, their alternation of generations process is about as simple as it gets. But with vascular plants, because they have a
Yeah, they don't mention that just yet. All right, so we're gonna practice that also